things over to Paul, who's going to get us started. Thanks again for being here today.
Thank you, Alex. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. And thanks to John for being willing to give this presentation. And so start off with, in the early to mid 90s, there was a sudden flurry of activity in researching the stories of the Workman and Temple families. A family member, Donald Rowland, here in Southern California, got interested. He was going to write a history of the family for his own family privately. It wound up being published publicly. I was working on my own book at that time, which didn't get published for a while, but I was busy at that. And in fact, it was 1995 when I first had contact with John, who was obviously living out in Clifton, England, where the Workmans were from. And as I'm sure he could talk about, he had some visitors from this area, family members, this area and back east, who were going to England to do research. So there was a happy confluence pretty much all at one time of learning a lot more about this. So those of us here could do our research, but here in LA, but to have somebody like John, not just living in Clifton, but having the skills to be able to ferret out research material. And this is 1995. We didn't have our digital electronic sources like we do now. It was just really invaluable. And so John's ability to get that stuff together and be able to interpret the story of the Workman brothers from the English end has been invaluable for all of us. So John, what I thought I would do maybe is just have you start off by briefly talking to the folks here about how you got started in this, what your background was that helped you develop the skills to be able to get into this research, and then go ahead and do your talk.
Yeah, I've got that, Paul. Can you see me?
Yes, we can see you.
All I've got on the screen is the heading. Is that what I'm supposed to have?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
So Paul, I think John's ready for his first question.
Yeah, that was the question I had. Sorry, was how you got started in doing your research, what your background was that kind of facilitated your ability to do what you did.
Well, I started doing this sort of thing, biography, researching, around about 1990, when I left the job I used to do before and realized I could spend a bit of time on something I was really keen to do, which was study our local history in this area, and particularly the remarkable people that it had produced over the years. I'd already started on that about 1990, as I said, when, as it happened, my efforts in that regard got quite a boost in 1995 when I had a visit from Los Angeles by two leading members of the Workman family, two judges, in fact, who were here in Clifton trying to do research on their family background, which they knew was at this village. They'd been having some problems. Somebody sent them to me, and they had a list of questions which they put to me, and it provided a challenge that I thought it might have been resolved in a month or two, but it took a lot longer to resolve it. But that didn't matter. I was keen to do it, and I did find out a lot about the Workman background, including the family background beyond the two brothers who arrived in the United States earlier than that, and also where they got the cash from to travel to the US, start up in business, and it led on from there, really. That spurred me interest, and eventually I found myself tracking these two young men from Clifton as best I could all the way to their destination on the Pacific coast, which was quite a challenge. Took me quite a time, but never flagged. Found it interesting, constantly challenging.
Great.
Yeah.
All right. Actually, I'm going to throw a second question to you. Do you think your accent would be very similar to what the brothers would have sounded like if they were speaking to us?
Well, I think so, probably. I think it probably would be. I mean, I've lived at Clifton for over 30 years. They'd lived their early lives at Clifton, and probably it'd be roughly the same. Yeah, I'm not faking any accent, and I think it would fit. Yeah, yeah.
Great. All right, John. With that, I think we can go ahead and get started. And thank you again for enlightening us on the story of the Workman brothers and their English background. Thank you.
Right. Thanks, Paul, for that introduction, and thanks, Alexandra. Thanks indeed to everybody at the museum for the welcome I've had in several visits I've made there. Most stimulating. But this has been quite a little challenge to appear on this screen with you. I'm delighted to do it. Can I just start by saying that the Workman name, as I understand it, has been big in Los Angeles for 180 years, in business and in public affairs. It hit the city's headlines with the boom of the 1880s and a mayor called William Henry Workman. But the Workman name really took off at much earlier than that, in November 1841, when one William Workman, who was the uncle of the mayor that I've just mentioned, arrived at Mission San Gabriel with a party of American adventurers from New Mexico. William is shown there on the right of the screen, the younger of the two brothers, David on the left. This doughty ex-fur trapper and trader really showed his mettle in the turmoil of the US-Mexican War in California and in the gold rush as a rancher and banker who gave his name put his name to the title to all kinds of tracts of land, including even Alcatraz Island. Casting the net a bit wider for clues to these two young men, it turns out that William Workman put his name to the first letter possibly to cross the Santa Fe Trail. That was in 1826, when he wrote from his trading base at Taos in New Mexico to his brother David in Franklin, Missouri. And Kit Carson, I know Kit Carson is now a controversial figure, but he began his memoirs with a respectful reference to David Workman. David Workman, the older of the two brothers, the one on the left of the picture, whom he described as a good man, who gave him his first job. So quite an interesting reference there to David Workman straight off with the memoirs of Kit Carson. Yeah, a slide there of a map of the north of England. Taking a second or so just to try and digest some of it. There's a lot on it, but it shows right in the middle a town of Penrith. The scale doesn't allow us to show Clifton or indeed Temple Sowerby, but Penrith is about 2 miles from Clifton, right in the middle there. Off to the left is Whitehaven, a port, and down at the bottom of the screen there is the port of Liverpool, about 80 miles from Whitehaven. The two young men, when they began their journey from Clifton to the United States in 1822, travelled across to Whitehaven, down the coast to Liverpool, and took off for Philadelphia. And in fact, it was a ship's manifest in 1822 that showed the brothers David and William Workman were saddlers aboard a vessel that landed at Philadelphia from Liverpool in 1822. There were two fearless young men from a quiet little English village who would find their destinies on the vast plains and deserts of the early American West, surviving fire and flood and clashes with natives and Mexicans to traverse the continent from the Atlantic to the Pacific coast. Their paths would cross those of legendary figures like John Charles Pathfinder Fremont and Mormon prophet Brigham Young, to mention just two. William led an American settler party over the Mojave Desert from New Mexico to California in 1841 to prosper as a rancher and banker. David reached the Golden State at the head of a wagon train, but did not live to see his son William Henry become mayor of 1880s Los Angeles. Yet neither of them surprisingly ever forgot their English origins. And William indeed made it back from Los Angeles for a 6-month visit to his ancestral homelands in 1851 at the age of 50. What I've been wondering all along was, and this has been my challenge, how did two young men from the English countryside project themselves onto the unfolding drama that was the American West. What sort of family could have produced two irrepressible adventurers? Indeed, three indeed, for their eldest sister Agnes crossed the Atlantic to Maryland in 1820 and married in Missouri. It leaves you wondering right away what was in their genes. What sort of a family could produce three members who could cross the Atlantic and really make a mark in the early American West? Anyway, David Workman was born, the elder of the two brothers. He was born to glassworker Thomas Workman and his Surrey-born wife Lucy at the village of Temple Sowerby in the northern English county of Westmoreland in July 1797. And his brother William was born there in the same place 2 years later. Their father Thomas originated from the neighbouring parish of Clifton, about 2 miles from Temple Sowerby, where generations of his forebears, certainly as far back as the 1640s, and probably much earlier than that, had owned a large farm called Brown Howe. And the thing to bear in mind when I've said that is that was held under the patronage of the aristocratic Lowther family, who had long held sway thereabouts. I should say that at the time the two brothers left home, the government in London was 300 miles away, and the real power in the land at that time was the Lowther family, successive generations of whom lived at this monumental house just 2 miles from Clifton, which had replaced an earlier dwelling from 2 or 3 centuries back. The Lowther family, just briefly about the Lowther family, there were amazing people who'd established themselves at Lowther, near Clifton, in the Middle Ages. The exact date isn't known, but certainly they've been there for about 800 years. And they rapidly achieved prominence and power in the land. And they did, in fact, or have, in fact, sent 58 members of that family to the Parliament in London as MPs. And also 13 members of the Lowther family have sat in the upper house, the House of Lords. So a really powerful, hugely powerful family, not just locally, but also nationally, but with huge influence on this particular area, including Clifton. An amazing family. The Workman family owned their farm under the patronage of the Lowthers from at least 1640. I know that for a fact, but probably it was a lot earlier than that. That held quite a substantial farm, and that could only have been done by having a very solid relationship with successive generations of the Lowther family. It was only through that they would have got the farm in the first place, and only through excellent relations with the all-powerful Lowther family that they would have retained their ownership of the farm that sustained them for at least 150 years that I know of, and probably a lot more. However, in 1762, at Clifton, one Thomas Workman, who owned the farm Brown Howe at Clifton, a local man, married Agnes Harrison. Now, Agnes was from a well-to-do local family of lawyers and landowners, and on the face of it, that should have done the Workman heritage quite a lot of good, and in fact it did, but there was a downside as well, it turned out. Thomas and Agnes had 4 children. Thomas in 1763, that was the firstborn son, and he, in fact, Thomas of 1763, later on would go on to be the father of the 2 emigrants, David and William. So Thomas in 1763 was followed by 2 girls and an ill-fated child named Harrison, a second son who sadly died aged just 2 months. Things happened, it seems, in the Workman family at Brown Howe that changed things a lot in the 1770s. And the remarkable thing was that young Thomas, who was then 13 years old in 1776, later to be the father of the two emigrants, he left home, never to return. He went over to a little place called Ersden, a colliery village in Northumberland, where he settled in with his uncle. His uncle was, in fact, a clergyman who came from Brown How around about 1760. He'd been a clergyman there for quite a long time, and he was to be a clergyman there for quite a bit longer. He'd done well in the church, surprisingly, and he'd come from the Workman family at Clifton. Thomas lived with him for quite a few years, having left his home at Brown How and never come back. It'd be quite a turning point in family fortunes, I think it's right to say. In 1776, as I said, it was 1776 or thereabouts, when Thomas left home at Clifton and settled in Newcastle, 80 miles away. A rather remarkable, in fact, an astonishing move for a little boy of that time. And other things happened as well at the Brown How farm at Clifton. And Father Thomas also left home about 1780 at Brown How, but he didn't live for long, because the next year, at the next parish of Broome, he was dead. He died aged 48. It must have been suddenly and unexpectedly, because he left no will. He died in the next parish aged just 48 with no will, which was rather surprising. Something desperate, I think, had happened there, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But in any case, the connection of the Workmans with the farm Brown How ends in 1780. This is 40 years before the two enterprising young men, David and William, left home, but 40 years earlier, the process began, I think, that led eventually, 40 years later, to the departure of the two irrepressible adventurers. Anyway, in 1780, Thomas, who was in the northeast, moved to London. A remarkable move, 300 miles south to London, where he married one Lucy Cook in 1789. A year or two earlier, Brown How, the farm, the substantial farm at Clifton that had been owned by the Workman family for so long, was sold, and the proceeds went to the young man, Thomas Workman, who was by then 21 years of age. He got the proceeds of the farm. It probably raised about £1,000, which was a huge amount at that particular time in the 1780s. It went to young Thomas Workman, later to be the father of the two emigrants. He became extremely well off. However, things got better financially anyway, for young Thomas. In 1794, his uncle, David Harrison, brother of his mother, died at Clifton, a rather well-to-do lawyer and landowner, and left him a very large inheritance. And Thomas came into that inheritance from David Harrison in 1794, still living in London. However, he didn't stay in London. With that windfall, a major inheritance of property at Clifton, he headed north with his wife, and by then they had two children. So they came north and moved to the village of Temple Sowerby. They didn't come back to Clifton, despite the fact that the inheritance of land and property from the Harrison family came to Thomas at Clifton. Thomas and his wife Lucy did not come back to Clifton. They came back north to Temple Sowerby, just 2 or 3 miles away, and lived there for quite some time. Rather surprisingly, but I think there was a good reason for that. And I think the good reason that Thomas had for moving from London to Temple Sowerby and not to Clifton was that he did not get on at all well with his mother. He didn't get on with his mother, surprisingly. He stayed at Temple Sowerby, out of the way. However, Mother Agnes Harrison Workman, died at Clifton in 1811. And that was a significant date. She left a will, a very substantial will actually. She was quite well off in her own right, but she made no mention of that in that will of her son Thomas, her eldest son Thomas. No mention in her will. Not only that, there's no mention on the headstone of her late husband, Thomas. Although she'd been married to Thomas Workman for some years, and he died in 1780. When she died 30 years later at Clifton, no mention of him on the headstone. She simply refers to herself on the headstone as Agnes Workman of Clifton, brother, I'll read this little bit off the headstone, brother to the late David Harrison, brother of late David Harrison of Clifton, who died July 31st, 1811. That's Agnes, of course, aged 78 years. Not only that, but unfortunately, the headstone, the gravestone, doesn't show up too clearly, which is understandable, having regard to its age. But it begins with a little bit that I'll read out, and that is that Agnes says, or said on behalf of Agnes on the headstone, sacred to the memory of Agnes Workman of Clifton, sister to the late David Harrison of Clifton, died July 31st, 1811, aged 78 years. And the next two sentences, I think, are of significance. A life of grief unknown to bounteous fare, a terribly mournful epitaph. A life of grief unknown to bounteous fare, till death relieved my agonizing prayer. The impression you have that she lived for a long, long time with an agonizing conscience about something. And it must have been something, I think, that happened at Brown Howe Farm, where she lived with her late husband, Thomas Workman, until 1780, when he died suddenly. Something terrible had happened there, which drove the little boy, just in his teens, to live 80 miles away and then down to London. Only brought him back as soon as his mother had died. His mother, incidentally, had been occupying the large house, which had been owned by her brother, David Harrison, that, of course, had been left, among other property, to young Thomas Workman, her son. But the son only came back after his mother died and was no longer there. It makes you think. Maybe it's the fact that I worked for, working life was in a job that perhaps caused me to, the police service actually, which perhaps caused me sometimes to have reason to be suspicious. But I'm certainly suspicious about what must have happened at Brown Howe Farm in 1780 or thereabouts, to drive the little boy away, and also that led, I think it led to the death of Thomas Workman, aged 48, without a will and quite suddenly, and also to this terribly mournful headstone of the widow. Anyway,
John, I think you had mentioned also that at this time it was very rare for people to travel far from home.
Oh, absolutely. This was Westmoreland County, the northern reaches of England, in 1780, when people really tended to travel no further than the local town on market day. They didn't travel far. There was no need to. It was a relatively prosperous area. There was no need even for a lot of emigration, really, unlike Scotland and Ireland, perhaps. And people didn't tend to travel very far. And here we have a family, or a young boy, a member of a family, traveling to Newcastle, 80 miles away, which was a startling sort of thing to do, and then finding himself in London, 300 miles to the south. Quite a remarkable achievement that must have been a talking point of the village in 1780, I've no doubt. So very unusual, yeah. Travel was not frequent up here at that time. Yeah. Anyway, the Agnes Harrison Workman tombstone. It's in Clifton churchyard. It says an awful lot. It says an awful lot. To my mind, it does anyway. Agnes Harrison Workman tombstone. Thomas and Lucy, Thomas Workman, later to be the father of the two emigrants, and his wife Lucy, who had come up from London, had 8 children actually. Harrison and John, 2 sons, died young. And And a remarkable development happened in November 1814. If you remember, Thomas Workman, by this time, and his wife Lucy, were really extremely well off. These were not your huddled masses yearning to break free. That certainly didn't apply to this Workman family on their emigration. These two were well off. They'd reaped the rewards of ownership of Brownhouse Farm, a large farm, and also they'd come into this very sizable inheritance from David Harrison. So they were quite well off. And in 1814, November, remarkably enough, they made a settlement on the three sons. They put a trust fund together in November 1814, referring to the three sons, not the three daughters, the three sons. That was David and William, and the third son was called Thomas. And the provision in the settlement was that they would receive, when they were 21, they would each receive the sum of £266, 13 shillings and 4pence. Now that funny little bit on the end refers to the strange English currency that applied until the 1970s. In effect, what it was one third of the total £800 that made up the £800 trust fund was to be left to each of the three sons, David, William, and Thomas. And in fact, David, I should say, David, they were living that the family, the Workman family at that time, were living that house that you see on the screen now. It is in fact two houses now, but until about 1830, it was one very large house. That was the house where David Harrison had lived, followed by his widow until the 1800s, and then also it had been occupied by his sister Agnes, mother of the two immigrants. When she died in 1811, that house came into the possession of Thomas Workman and his wife Lucy with their children. Quite a substantial house, quite a big one. Again, I emphasize, not your huddled masses yearning to break free. They were a substantial family. Anyway, David had picked up his, or at least he picked up in July 1818. He was 21, was David, the oldest son, and he must have asked at that time, I'm 21, I want my share of the trust fund. I want my £266. He must have done. Thomas and Lucy listened to him, I've no doubt, but they didn't give him the full £266. They gave him £100, £100. But that doesn't sound much now. But at that time, it was a huge amount for any 21-year-old to have, certainly, and would have been the talk of the village, I've no doubt. £100. With that, David left home. He went across to Whitehaven, as I mentioned earlier, down the coast to Liverpool, and across to the United States with his £100 share of the £800 settlement. That took him as far as Missouri, where he went into business as a saddler in 1819, I think it must have been, when he got there, and he immediately went into business as a saddler in 1819. However, trouble in the United States at that particular time, the economy was in difficulties. David's money started to run out. He had a partner in business, but that was dissolved. So in effect, David Workman, lately from Clifton, now established as a saddler in the Midwest in Missouri, needed more cash, and he needed a new partner as well, preferably. And remarkably, you may think, he'd only left in 1818. Remarkably, by 1822, June, he was back home at Clifton, at that house. June 1822, he was back there. He'd come all the way back again. And while he was there, that June 1822, he collected the rest of his share of the £800. That was £166 plus 13 shillings and 4pence. the rest of his share of the £800. That wasn't all he collected, though, at this time, at that house at Clifton. He also collected a new business partner, and that was his younger brother, William. William, by this stage, was 22, and he also asked for and was given his share of the £800, which in his case came to £266. So, William and David left that house in June 1822, David with £166 and William with £266, a monumental amount of money, but it would have been difficult to put an equivalent on now, but we're certainly talking about at least £25,000 or whatever, dollars rather, a huge amount at that particular time. And it must have been an unheard of amount for two young men at the ordinary working village of Clifton. Anyway, they left home, down to Liverpool, crossed to Philadelphia, and by early 1823, they were back at David's neglected saddlery in Missouri. Early 1823. David, in fact, probably arrived a little bit earlier. He had to get there as fast as he could to see to his neglected business, of course. But William certainly arrived at the Missouri saddlery in 1823. The business, with all the renewed cash, of course, and working together as partners, and in 1824, just a little interesting little development here. In 1824, the brothers, David was a senior partner, took on an apprentice. The apprentice, I know his name's a little bit controversial these days, but they took on Kit Carson as a 14-year-old apprentice at the saddlery. It didn't last very long. Eventually, Kit decided it was not his cup of tea working at saddles and such like, and he left for New Mexico. Anyway, William, by this time, 1825, William, he was still just 25 years of age. He hadn't long been in the US, really. He'd only been there 2-3 years. He decided that Missouri was a bit quiet for him, I think, really. He must have been an enormously forceful individual, the younger brother William in particular. David also, but William must have been a man of remarkable self-reliance, because in 1825, fairly fresh in the United States, still just 25 years of age, headed west on the new Santa Fe Trail, and he crossed to Taos, New Mexico, where he became a very enterprising businessman among what was then the fur trappers of the American West, a leading fur trapper, in fact. And eventually went into business there. Perhaps his skills lay more in business than in trapping. He went into business. He was very successful in business there, was William, and a tremendously successful business. He also met up there with Kit Carson, of course, as you might imagine, and he did extremely well for himself. Did William in New Mexico until 1841, when things really got too hot for him. Unfortunately, he was such a forceful, powerful, influential figure there that he began to challenge the Mexican authorities in New Mexico, and by 1841 he was being accused of insurrection, even of making an attempt on the Mexican governor of New Mexico, and also of trying to link up with the independent state of Texas in their designs on New Mexico. So really, 1841 meant that William had to go. He had to leave. He had to leave New Mexico, where he'd been in business for 16 years, very successfully, a leading figure in Taos, New Mexico. He had to leave, but he didn't set off back this westwards. You might have thought he would hightail it back to Missouri, but he didn't. He headed to California at the head of a party of tough, like himself, American adventurers and ex-fur trappers. And he arrived after crossing of 2,000, I think 1,200 miles or thereabouts, from New Mexico to California. He arrived at the head of this settler party, or this party of trappers and adventurers, at Mission San Gabriel, near Los Angeles. And we know exactly, as it happens, we know exactly the date when he arrived there, because attached to the ranch house that he built at La Puente, William Workman fixed a plaque which said William Workman arrived November 5th, Guy Fawkes Day, 1841. A wonderful clue. They arrived November 5th is clear enough, but Guy Fawkes Day, of course, may be unfamiliar to some of us, but it's a very significant day still in English history, because 5th of November 1705 was when a revolutionary called Guy Fawkes, who came from York, attempted to blow up the Houses of Parliament, kill the members, and even kill the king who was opening the Parliament at that particular time. That was his plot. He packed the undercroft of the Houses of Parliament with barrels of gunpowder with the intention of an enormous explosion that would kill the regime. He was discovered and suffered for his trouble, something terrible, as you can imagine. But it's been known ever since November 5th as Guy Fawkes Day. Even though it's a revolutionary thing, Guy Fawkes really got his name in the annals of English history on November 5th, when he got himself arrested for attempting to demolish the whole of the ruling classes of England at one stroke. 5th of November 1705. And William in 1841 would have well remembered the little celebrations that used to go on in England regarding this November 5th. And he put it on his plaque, which was a very useful thing to do for our purposes, because it fixes the date exactly when he arrived in California, 5th of November 1841. Yeah. I think, Paul, there's a slide of St. Cuthbert's Church. There we are. Yeah. St. Cuthbert's Church at Clifton. A very ancient church, and people keep asking me, having achieved a certain status as village historian, people keep asking me, well, what date was the church built? You can tell us when Guy Fawkes blew up the Houses of Parliament. What date was the church built at Clifton? Well, the simple answer is nobody knows. It is said by people who know architecture better than I do that the part of the building around the door there, which you see, is probably 13th century. And that's all you could say there probably, is that the church is medieval with some parts from the 13th century. A very, very interesting old church, there's no doubt about that, medieval. And one thing that you can't see very well, perhaps, from that image is an oval plaque on the wall, an oval plaque, right in the middle, an oval plaque. It has a script on it, which is never going to be photographed properly, but it can be read when the sun is in the right direction, casting a shadow over the lettering. And what it commemorates, in fact, is the death of David Harrison in 1794, and says a bit about him. It commemorates the death of a very leading member of the community at Clifton, David Harrison, whose beneficence, of course, led to Thomas Workman achieving quite a bit of wealth in the village, and eventually being able to raise the sum of £800 to finance the departure of his two sons, David and William. But it all came from David Harrison, and that David Harrison is commemorated in his death of 1794 on that plaque on the south side of the church. Nearby in the churchyard, just below that plaque actually, is the tombstone of sorry, is a tombstone of the Workman family. The Workman family tombstone. Now, surprisingly, you may think, that tombstone was arranged and put there in 1841. Sorry, not 1841. That was put there in 1851 during the course of William Workman's return trip from California to Clifton in 1851. One of the things that he did during this return trip, a remarkable trip all the way from California, huge expedition of thousands of miles, obviously, but he had plenty of energy left when he got to Clifton. And one of the things that he organized was that gravestone commemorating the members of his family. And that remained there and is still there, in fact. But where the railings went to is anybody's guess. But they're no longer there. But they were erected. It was placed there by William Workman in 1841. A remarkable little family history. It has one or two mistakes in it, shall I say. I'm not criticizing William. He was working from records, probably quite old in some cases, but the records of dates and births sometimes are slightly out, I've discovered. Interestingly, but a remarkable headstone of the Workman family put there by William Workman in 1851 and drawn, perhaps just as remarkably, and drawn out by William's sister Mary, his younger sister Mary, who actually drew it, and the drawing went back with William to California. A remarkable achievement, I think. Anyway, David, back in California, William of course continued to prosper. He did extremely well in all kinds of branches, areas of business. He had his ranch at La Puente, which was a great success, and he actually ventured into banking as well under the influence of his son-in-law, Francis Temple, into banking. He was certainly well enough off to do it, I suppose, but unfortunately, by the 1870s, California was in the grip of an economic crisis. The economy collapsed. That took William's bank down with it, and he had a lot of money out on credit, and people wanted their money back, obviously, and the bank couldn't stand it. The bank collapsed, and everything that William had worked for, he was now 76 years old, everything he'd worked for was gone, as he saw it. And in May 1876, one dark day in May 1876, being faced with the loss of everything that he'd worked for all those years, huge success in business in California, had gone. He'd lost it. And he took himself to the parlor of his home and, sadly, tragically, shot himself dead, age 76. Sadly, he couldn't stand the disgrace. Of course, his brother David had died some years earlier in a fall from his horse in the gold country of North California. So that consigned the two brothers, I'm afraid, who'd left Clifton so many years earlier, consigned them to history. But I suppose you could say, without being too frivolous, they'd both lived up to the ultimate accolade of the West. They died with their boots on, both of them. Quite a story, I thought. Quite a story. Anyway, you might wonder, finally, what were the effects of the emigration on the Clifton family. The two brothers had gone west. Indeed, the daughter had gone as well. What was the effects of that emigration on the Clifton family? The Workmans were a close family. There's no doubt about that, and they strove to keep in touch and longed for a brother's return. In fact, it's quite clear from letters that passed between the old people at Clifton and the young men in the West that Mary, at least, and probably the rest of the family, really rather thought that the brothers had gone west, but would come back. They would come back home eventually. They hadn't gone for good. They did go for good, of course, but the correspondence continued between Clifton, the home at Clifton, and the two brothers, as far as it was possible, having regard to the fact that they were moving west all the time. They did keep in touch remarkably well, and the two brothers that had gone never forgot Clifton. They never forgot the homes that they'd gone from, living in California, living such exciting lives, I suppose, but they never forgot Clifton. And of course, descendants continued to visit Clifton after the brothers had gone. The first one that I know of, anyway, there was of course William's return visit in 1851. There was David's return visit right at the outset in 1822. But members of their descendants of the two brothers in California kept visiting Clifton. In 1879, Elijah Workman, William's uncle, Elijah Workman, came back from Los Angeles to sort out the estate at Clifton, 1879. So he was in Clifton all that trip from California, and he oversaw the sale of the remaining property at Clifton. In 1904, a young man called William Henry Workman Jr. Came to Clifton during the course of a world visit that I think, a world tour rather, that I think was part of his convalescence from a serious illness, William Henry Workman. And the much more famous, of course, William Henry Workman, the mayor of Los Angeles, later to be city treasurer, came to Clifton from California in 1912 with his wife, Mary Jr., and his daughter, to see Clifton. To see what he said, in effect, because he left a detailed account of that journey, was that his lifetime's ambition, in effect, had been to see the early home of his father, David. His father, David, of course, had left home at Clifton in 1822, 90 years earlier, and he died in the 1850s. And yet his son, his youngest son, William Henry, who led such a fantastic life in the United States, beginning in Missouri and eventually ending in Los Angeles, where he held very high-profile positions, including mayor, had always had this ambition to get back home, as he saw it, to Clifton, to see the early home of his father. And he did it in 1912 with his wife and daughter. So a remarkable visitor in 1912. And that is a picture of a part of the old Workman home, still very much as it would have looked when William Henry Workman came here in 1912, I'm sure, with not me, not William, I'm afraid, not even William Henry, but just me in front of the house 2 or 3 years ago. The house is still there, still looking very much probably as it would have done when the emigrants left it. They would certainly recognize it, I would imagine. So it's still there, and that's me standing in front of it quite recently. I have to say recently, 2 or 3 years ago. Anyway, I'm grateful. I'm grateful to you for your patience, and hope that what I've been able to say about this fantastic trip that these two young men made to California has been of some interest. It's been the question of the emigration of these two has been quite an abiding passion of mine for 25 years, since the two judges came here they indeed were great grandsons of David Workman, the older of the two emigrants. It was their great grandsons, both called David, who came from the United States in 1995 and found me to do a bit of research on the story, which I was delighted to do, of course. Anyway, thanks very much indeed for your indulgence. Thanks to Paul for his introduction, and to Alex
John,
for running
speaking of the research, can you say a little bit about what that process was like? Where did your research take you, and what resources did you actually have to look at?
Yeah, well, the two judges, both being lawyers, of course, who came to me and started me off, had very specific requirements. What they were looking for was, what was the family story before David and William? What was the family story? They set up in business, we know that, in Missouri, but how did they do it? What was the source of capital? What was the amount of capital that they had? Questions like that. So there were detailed questions which they'd worked out between them, the two lawyers, and they put them to me. And I knew that if it might not be possible to answer them, but that it might just be possible. But what I also knew was that if it was possible to answer those detailed questions about two young men who'd left Clifton nearly 100 years earlier, 200 years earlier rather, then the answers must be found in what was called the Lowther Archive at Carlisle. And that was the monumental record of the business of successive generations of the Lowther family, the aristocratic Lowther family, keeping records for centuries. The earliest dated record, I think, is about 1208 or something. So the very, very early records going a long way back, and a massive volume of stuff, a really massive volume of material kept in the county archive at Carlisle. So I knew that if I was going to find out anything, I had to look there. And eventually, it took time, but eventually I did find what I was looking for. I found out quite a lot about the past of the Workman family at Clifton, and that is where I found after some considerable research, I found the actual settlement document of November 1814, which specified exactly where the two brothers got their money to begin the emigration and what the amounts were. And also remarkably, but I was quite startled to find it, was their receipts on the back of that document, the signatures of the two young men for the money that they got as shares of that £800. The receipt was there. Probably when I turned it over, it hadn't been seen for 200 years, but that clinched it, really.
That's remarkable.
But I would emphasize that there was no means of researching that Lowther archive except by going to Carlisle and getting stuck into this monumental record that had been kept. There was no real index to it, a bit of an index, but it wasn't very good. And the one thing that might surprise people nowadays was that there was no computer access. The only way you could research it was by going to Carlisle and digging among the dusty archives of 200 years ago. No other way of doing it. Not there.
That's wonderful.
Not 25 years ago.
Another question. Oh, go ahead, John. Sorry.
No, I was going to say there's no other way of doing it other than to get stuck into the. But I was so intrigued by this, so intrigued that despite the fact that off and on, not working every day, but whenever I had time, I would go to Carlisle and pull out the appropriate volumes of the Lowther archives and look for this material from the past of the Workmans. And eventually it paid off when I found out really everything I was looking for. I was able to answer all those basic questions that the two judges had put to me in 1995. It took me a few years to do it, off and on, not working every day, but off and on. I was able to answer all the questions, even as I said, down to where did they get the money from, and the receipts signed for it as well. So I thought that was quite startling. I was quite pleased about that.
Absolutely. We have another question that you and Paul might want to chime in on that just came in, and it's about David Workman. Someone's asking, where did he die in the gold country of Northern California, and where is he buried?
Yeah, David died, if I remember rightly. I'm speaking from memory now. He died at oh heck, it's Northern California. I know the place where it was, and I've forgotten it. I can't remember it. It's a place with a French name, and his remains, I believe, were brought back to California, to La Puente for interment in the mausoleum. That's as I understand it.
Yeah,
The funeral was in Los Angeles.
right. There were a couple of different stories about that. One is that they had been taking animals to the gold fields. That was how they made their money, market for fresh beef. And an animal had gotten loose from the camp. And so in the middle of the night, David mounted an animal and rode up in this steep territory. The cliff was 200 feet from which he fell. So you'd think 20 stories down. It probably took a while to get to his body. Some Masons, people in the Masonic fraternity, found a pin on his coat for the Masonic Lodge, and they were the ones who went and retrieved his body. But he was not buried for about 3 or 4 months after that. So whether it was because it took a while to retrieve the body, to do the whatever process of embalming, if they did that kind of thing, it's kind of a mystery that way. And then he was the first documented burial at the El Campo Santo Cemetery that we have at the Homestead Museum.
Yeah.
And,
Well, I've wondered about the time lapse. The circumstances of his death are, as I understood them, fit what you just said. But I've wondered how it came that the funeral took place in near Los Angeles, but it must have been quite a bit afterwards. But
there might have been some discussion with the widow about what to do, because the nearest cemetery would have been San Gabriel Mission if you were a Catholic, but I don't think David was a converted Catholic. So it would have to have been in Los Angeles if that was going to be the case. So maybe there was some discussion about that. I think, John, the town that they always say would be the closest was LaGrange. And LaGrange is...
no, I was going to call it Lagrange. Lagrange, is it? Yeah. That's right. Sorry, I'd forgotten the name of the place where it happened, but Lagrange, yeah.
Yeah, somewhere near there, Stanislaus County, so on the way to the southern mines.
Stanislaus County, I've got it now, it's come back again, yeah.
Right, right.
Yeah.
One more thing I'll say about that is the descendants of David wanted to move him from the cemetery at the museum to Evergreen Cemetery in Los Angeles, and they even built a monument with his name and date of birth and date of death and all that. But Walter P. Temple, who owned the homestead at the time, this is, I would imagine, early 20s or somewhere around there, refused to release his remains. So there's actually 2 monuments to David in 2 different cemeteries.
Right, yeah, right. Well, he deserves it. He began all of this, didn't he?
John, I wondered if you had any thoughts about what did happen with William and David's grandparents, why the older Thomas Workman left his home and moved somewhere else and died the year after, and why, if that's one part of it, why the mother did not mention her son, William and David's father, in her will. Do you have any ideas what that might be?
Yeah, well, there was clearly, I think it absolutely clear from the circumstantial evidence that there was some severe domestic upset at the old ancestral farm at Clifton in the 1770s. And I wondered if it began with the death of the little boy, aged 2 months in 1772, leaving 3 children. The eldest brother, of course, being Thomas. But he left home. He must have left home when he was about 13. An amazing thing to do, really. Leaving 2 daughters and a mother. And one of the daughters left home as well. So there was virtually nobody left of the Workman family at Brown House Farm, where they lived for so long, 150 years that I know of. There was virtually nobody left in 1780. And I think something catastrophic happened at the farm to bring that about. And also to mean that there was a complete break between Agnes Harrison Workman, and her son Thomas, eldest son. Nothing acknowledged in Agnes's will. Nothing said about eldest son Thomas. And when you look at this gravestone, Agnes's gravestone at Clifton churchyard, you can't help but think, the more you look at that, the tremendously mournful wording of that headstone. A life of grief, unknown to bounteous fare, till death relieved my agonizing prayer. Really, really tragic headstone, which I think is a headstone of someone who had suffered agonies of remorse. I think remorse is the word. Agonies of remorse for a very long time, like 30 years since the loss of her husband.
Sure.
I think some domestic problem arose that was disastrous.
We had another question that came in, John, from Kevin. He said, did you say that William Workman returned to England from California in 1851? This would have been in the middle of the California gold rush. Why did William return?
Well, hard to say really, but I think when you think about it, William must have left California in late 1850. He must have left perhaps September, October, and that was just as I think California became a state of the Union, did it not, in 1850?
Correct.
September.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's correct.
Yes.
He realized the state, things are more settled. Not only that, but I think also it had wind, that it had information from these letters passing between Clifton that his eldest sister was seriously ill at home at Clifton. He wanted to see her. He didn't quite make it. She died, his eldest sister died just before he got here. But I think that was an objective of his. He was extremely wealthy by that time, phenomenally wealthy. His winnings from the gold rush must have been absolutely phenomenal. He was very well to do, things were quite settled. He was a man of ultimate desire to travel, I believe, and it was a monumental journey involving a trip down to Mexico, perhaps, and then up to New York, where he had his photograph taken, if you remember. And he arrived at Clifton in March 1851, but he must have been traveling for about 6 months. So he must have left California about just after the state was declared the State of the Union and things were more settled. It took him quite a while to arrive. And I think that the spur to him was very little was left of his family. His mother had died in 1830. His father had died in 1843. David was living in California. There was very little left of the Clifton family, and one of them was his eldest sister. And he learned that she was seriously ill, and she didn't make it. She didn't live long enough for them to meet. But I think that was the final spur, seeing his sister.
One thing I'll mention, John, is we just were going through the estate of Josette Temple, one of the descendants, and we found a document from Veracruz in Mexico in February 1851 that would allow him to pass through the port and then make his way into the Caribbean and then up to England. So we do have a few little tidbits like that here and there that we're finding.
That's right. You could almost track his journey from California via Veracruz in 1851 February. New York was the photograph that was taken. We believe, don't we? 1851 in New York, and he was certainly in London by, I think it was about March 10th, 1851. He was at Clifton by March 21st, 1851. That's definite. And by on March 29th, I think it was, 1851, we've got an absolutely positive sighting at Clifton, because a visitor came to that house that we're looking at now on the screen, came to that house to do the census, the 10-year census in 1851, March. He came to Clifton in 1851, March 29th, I think it was. And there he found two remaining members, Mary and Thomas, of the old Clifton family, but he also found a visitor. He simply recorded William Workman, visitor. That's all it said. William Workman, visitor. So he was definitely back here by March 29th, 1851. But he must have been on the move for 6 months. He must have left California in about September. Various reasons spurred him on, but I think the big one was the fact that he'd heard that his eldest sister was very ill at Clifton, and he wanted to see her. I think it was
And
simple as that.
another question we have, John, is could there be something in court records about what may have upset Agnes?
In the 1770s?
Mm-hmm.
No, I don't think so. I spent a bit of time on that, no, I think whatever it was how do I put it, was quietly suppressed by the influential family, particularly David Harrison, her brother, a very influential man at Clifton. And whatever had gone wrong, I think he would have seen it as his duty to try to suppress it in everybody's interest. I may be wrong on that, I don't know, but I don't think you're likely to find anything about what actually happened. You can only draw your own conclusions. It was something so tragic that it led to the sudden departure of a 13-year-old boy from home, the departure of his father from the home, just over the boundary into the next parish, and his death in a few months later. A sister left home, and on top of that, there's the wording of the headstone, and there's the fact that when Thomas came back from the south with his family to claim his inheritance at Clifton, he didn't actually come to Clifton until just after his mother had died, 30 years after her husband died. I just think that the whole circumstances point to some tragic occurrence that happened at Brown Howe in probably 1778 or 9, in the 1770s anyway.
No, David, John, one thing that comes up with David Harrison is that name was used in successive generations. So William Workman's daughter named 2 sons David Harrison Temple. They both unfortunately died as toddlers, and then she had a son she named John Harrison Temple. So that bequest from William and David's ancestor was very important to them, obviously. And
yeah, well, that's it. I'm glad you mentioned that, Paul, because the name Harrison was a vital connection that happened at Clifton when Thomas Workman, later to be the father of the 2 emigrants, married Agnes Harrison of the well-to-do family at Clifton. That was in 1762. That should have been good. No, that was good, but it led eventually, I think, to something of a disaster. And every attempt, it seemed, just about every attempt to commemorate the name Harrison in the Workman family in respect of their good fortune was blighted by misfortune. First of all, the little boy called Harrison, son of Thomas and Agnes, died in infancy, just a couple of weeks old, in 1772. Later on, Thomas and Lucy named one of their sons Harrison. He died aged 15. Every attempt, it seemed, to commemorate the Harrison thing, in so many cases, didn't turn out too well. I'm almost inclined, well, I'm being superstitious, and I'm not. I'm almost inclined to think that the Harrison name somehow or other brought a blight on the Workmans, brought a bit of a jinx, or started something off, particularly the death of that little boy aged just a couple of weeks in the 1770s. Then the Thomas and Lucy's son Harrison, who died aged 15, and subsequent attempts to commemorate the Harrison name tended also to end in trouble.
right. But without David Harrison's money, presumably William and David wouldn't have been able to have gone to America. Does that sound reasonable?
Without the
inheritance from David Harrison, the uncle.
Well, they might have done, but I suspect they wouldn't. I mean, the fact that they came into all this cash, gave them the choice at least. If they'd stayed here, then they might indeed have simply inherited Brown House Farm or the house in the village. That wouldn't have left them exactly in penury, but it wouldn't have provided them with a massive amount of funds to finance the emigration that they did and start up in business.
Sure, sure.
Now, speaking of those massive amounts of funds, we have another question along those lines.
Yeah.
Kevin asks, how would David and William Workman safely have traveled with large sums of money from England to Missouri? Was this dangerous at that time?
I think it probably would have been, but it would have been. But I think these were a pair of very tough lads who could look after themselves. I can't imagine anybody wanting to mess with them. I've thought of this myself. Well, how did they do it? Their belongings were listed on the ship's manifest. It didn't say anything about a lot of cash, of course, but it listed bed and bedding and carpenter's tools and such like, but said nothing about the cash they had, which is understandable. They wouldn't have advertised the fact that they were carrying anything different from anybody else. But I'd imagine if as emigrants, they were carrying over, well, £600 thereabouts between them, $25,000 or whatever. They were carrying a massive amount of money, which was more than anybody else. But they wouldn't advertise that fact. And if anybody had suspected them, I think these two lads would have been capable of looking after themselves. I'm sure of it.
Now, going back to the Harrison name, we just had a message on Facebook from a family member, Cheryl Temple, who says, my nephew, Jason Temple, used Harrison for his son's middle name. So the name is still being used in the family.
Yeah, I understand that. Well, I'm delighted with that, because I think it started with, I wouldn't say a jinx exactly, because I don't believe in such things, but I think it had unfortunate connotations early on, with the death of the little boy aged just a couple of weeks, and then a 15-year-old boy in the same family, and other instances of the Harrison name not working out too well. But that it isn't. It's possible to make too much of that, I'm sure, and
Yes.
whatever it was, it must have resolved itself by now, I think.
Yes, I agree. We have a comment from Clark watching on Zoom with us today, who said he really enjoyed your presentation, and thanks you, John. And we have a nice message here from Janet Austin, which is a name you might recall. A longtime docent at the Homestead. She says, I enjoyed your presentation, John, and it brought back memories of a day my husband and I spent with you when you showed us around the area several years ago. I was then and am still a docent at the Homestead Museum. Thanks, from Janet and Pete Austin.
Well, that's quite moving, really. I do remember Janet. Yeah, I do remember. Yeah. Oh, quite moving. Yeah.
Even though Janet's from Devon, whole different part of the country, but
I remember well, yeah.
All right, we'll give folks a minute here to ask any additional questions. Oh, here's another one. So if you do have additional questions, this is the time to ask them.
I'll be delighted to try and answer. Yeah.
Annette says, thank you so much. This has been fascinating. Thank you, Annette, for joining us. Okay, we'll see if we have any more questions that come in. Paul, do you have any more questions for John?
I don't think so.
Right. Well,
John, I can only imagine how delighted the judges must have been to get this kind of information from you.
Yeah. Well, I think, as I said, I'd lived at Clifton when they came here and saw me. I'd lived at Clifton for about 10 years, and I'd achieved, rightly or wrongly, some sort of reputation as being the local expert. So every village in England has a local expert on local history. I'd achieved that reputation, accidentally or otherwise, and they were pointed to me because I did have that reputation. Someone sent them to me, and I met them. And I met them actually, as a matter of interest, on the very day in which the whole village was closed off to commemorate a battle. The last military encounter on English soil happened at Clifton in 1745, and on that particular day, when the two judges were here, the village was it must have been in uproar because there were simulated battles going on with a lot of noise and bangs and whatnot. Roads closed, and from all the turmoil emerged the two judges to meet me here and put their questions to me, which I was delighted to receive and have a go at, of course. Yeah, it was
I
a memorable day.
I can only imagine. Mary Bartley, a family member, also a descendant, says, "Thank you, John. This has been very informative."
Oh, I'm glad it meant something to to people in California. Yeah. A remarkable family at Clifton, they undoubtedly were. It's difficult to put over how it's tempting to think that I think the point was they had a very strong connection with the all-powerful Lowther aristocratic family just down the road. The credit with them was good, and there's probably good reason for that. They were on good terms for a long time with the all-powerful Lowther family, which the Workmans, that is, which really started this story off. But again, we can't prove it because it's lost in the mists of time.
Yes. We just had a nice note here from Sherwood, who says, "I'm in awe of the depth of programming provided by the Workman and Temple Homestead Museum. Thank you, John and Paul."
Well, it's nice of everybody. Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you, obviously, Alex and Paul. Yeah.
Well, we thank you so much, John, for conquering Zoom. You did it. You did such a beautiful job for us here today.
I should say in conclusion that I'm far happier standing before an audience that I can see. But I just tried to make a little adaptation in this case. Yeah.
And one thing to add too, Alex, before we close this down, is that John did do a series of posts for the museum's blog earlier this year. So you can go to homesteadmuseum.blog and do a search for John Sharpe or for David or William Workman and find those posts. You can get more information and detail about what he talked about today.
Yes, and we have from Michael, who says, "Very interesting, John," from Michael in Carlisle. Our volunteer, longtime docent, Kathy Gunn, says, "I have been a docent at the Workman and Temple Family Homestead Museum since 1985 and have been telling fragments and versions of the stories you've provided far more, or have been telling versions of the story you have provided. Thanks," from Kathy.
Oh, that's nice. Yeah, that's nice. Yeah.
Yes.
I'm happy. Yeah, good. Thank you.
Well, it's been really wonderful having you with us today, John, and having you do this for us on Zoom. We are very thankful to have this recording to preserve all of the work that you've done and the way you tell these family stories. You know, one thing I wrote down as you were speaking is you were saying these brothers were not your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. You know, you provide a different perspective that we don't necessarily bring to that story being here in the US, thinking about their journey and their travel. So we greatly appreciate all the work you put in, and thank you so much.
Thanks, Alex. A pleasure. A pleasure. Indeed.
All right, Paul, you've got one more slide for us, right?
We do. So we have upcoming programs here. So we have Something's Brewing, Women in Tea in 20th Century Los Angeles. This is based on about a year's now worth of blog posts called From the Homestead Kitchen series. So Alex and a couple of our colleagues will be doing that Sunday, May 9th at 2. We are also going to continue with another installment of Female Justice presentation about May Otis Blackburn, who had a interesting religious group. Keep forgetting the name of it, something like the Royal Order of the Divine Arms of the Great 11 or something like that. It was one of many such groups in Los Angeles in the early 20th century. She was tried for fraud and wound up being a kind of an important trial for religious freedom in California in the late 1920s. And then that's Sunday, May 23rd at 2. And then on the 26th of May, Wednesday at 6, Roaring 20s Trivia Night. This is the second trivia night that we have had. A fun way to explore history and interact with other people who love trivia. So be sure to join us for one or all of these programs. You can follow us on our social media platforms, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter with the handle @Homestead Museum.
And a couple more comments coming in. One from Vince who says, thank you for a most interesting presentation. It was very well done. And then one from Donna. And Donna, I'm not quite sure if you're being lighthearted here, serious, but a question about a relationship to the Beatle George Harrison from the Harrison family line. Wouldn't that be something to discover?
Well, I've been asked by once or twice to investigate various well-known connections of the Harrison name with the Harrison of this story, but I can't make anything fit, so I don't know.
Good try though. Good effort, John.
Yeah.
All right.
Right.
On that note, thanks again. Good evening to you, John. You're getting ready to wind your day down as we're still getting ready to start ours up. So thank you again for the time difference and navigating that with us, and also Zoom. We're very grateful.
Thanks, Alex. Beautifully done, and for your reassuring manner as well. Yeah.
Oh.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much for joining us, everyone. There'll be a recording of the program soon on our website, or like I said, you can check out our YouTube channel. Just Google Homestead Museum YouTube. All right. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.